It's my house. Obey me. No matter what you say, Mom is going to live in this house. As soon as I strongly opposed the idea of my mother-in-law living in our home, my husband, Jack, burst into anger like a raging fire and said that. I frowned and replied, but this house was handed down to me by my parents. Why is Jack boasting that it's his house when it's mine? However, I tried to have a decent conversation, but if Jack kept taking an authoritative attitude, thinking he could make me obey him, he raised his voice and said, I'm the one paying the rent. So this house is mine. It's not yours. I was at a loss for words. I'm not even having you pay for it. As I couldn't say anything, Jack thought he had one, snorted, and plopped down on the living room sofa. I let out a big sigh. My name is Amy. I currently live with my daughter, Sarah, who is going to be an 8th grader, and my husband, Jack. We live in a 2-story house, and Jack and I started living in this house about 3 years after we got married. Originally, my parents lived in this house, but they decided to give up the house and move to the countryside, saying they had something they wanted to do there. At that time, my parents decided to rent this house to us, Jack and I, who were married and had Sarah in my belly. I suppose my parents were concerned about their income even though they had moved to the countryside. Well, it was cheaper than living in an apartment or buying a new house, so Jack and I were happy to pay the rent. I work as a magazine editor and make a decent amount of money. Originally, I was an editor for a fashion magazine, but now I've been entrusted with being the editor-in-chief of other magazines. I've always enjoyed thinking about the writing and design in magazines, so this job is like a calling for me. By the way, I met my husband, Jack, through work, during a meeting. He was a photographer. His style was to shoot anything he thought was nice, be it landscapes or people, and then ask for it to be published in a magazine. Well, there aren't many times that what he shoots and what the editorial department wants to post coincide. So, I guess I earn more. In fact, he's a freelance photographer, so he's not stable in terms of income and can't be relied upon. In the midst of that, we ended up raising our daughter, Sarah. I'm busy with my work in the editorial department, but since Jack is a freelance photographer, he doesn't go out when he doesn't feel like it, and he has no work or anything. So I left our little daughter to Jack. I have a stable income, so I thought it was only natural to divide the roles like this, but there was someone who outright rejected our role division. That was Jack's mother. For me, she's my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law didn't necessarily believe in male superiority over women, but she had a personality that couldn't tolerate her own son taking care of the child or doing household chores. So when she found out that I was working outside and that Jack was taking care of the child and doing housework at home, she became furious. Why is my Jack doing all the wife's work when she's out having a break? I was surprised at that. Jack had been living at home until he married me, so my mother-in-law should have known that he was a freelance photographer and didn't have a stable income. However, it seemed that how much Jack was earning didn't matter to my mother-in-law. What mattered to her was whether her precious only son was not having a hard time. Excuse me, I'm not just taking a break outside. I'm working hard outside every day. I'm just having Jack look after Sarah while I'm gone. When I came home after finishing my work, my mother-in-law was standing like a statue in the doorway waiting for me, and I was really surprised. My mother-in-law's house is a 3-hour drive away, so I thought she wouldn't come so easily. But she must have been worried about her son Jack. As soon as she came to our house while I was gone, she began to lecture me immediately. You know, even if you say you're working outside, you're married to Jack, right? You have to think of Jack first, you know? And yet you're pushing child-rearing and housework onto Jack. If this was going to happen, you shouldn't have had a child. I inadvertently reacted to my mother-in-law's words with a huh? I somehow knew that my mother-in-law disliked me. After all, her son was the most important person to her, so she probably resented me, the bride who stole her son through marriage. Even so, I thought she would cherish her son's married life and the child born between her son and me. But it seems I was wrong about that. My mother-in-law really only cared about her son, Jack, and considered everyone else a nuisance. On top of disliking me, she started saying she didn't need my daughter, Sarah, either. Finally, she grinned and looked towards the living room where Sarah was, saying, if you're gonna keep bothering Jack, we might have to think about sending Sarah somewhere to be adopted. I was instantly irritated by her words and told her clearly, please leave. My mother-in-law, already disliking me, frowned and said, what are you saying to your husband's mother? but I grabbed her arm and said, "Mother-in-law or not, you're an outsider to this house. Who do you think you are, telling me to give up my dear child for adoption? We won't associate with you anymore, so leave." I then took her outside, escorted her to the gate, and immediately closed the door behind me. She made a fuss in front of the house for a while, but I ignored it. During that time, Jack was doing what, you might ask? Well, since his mother came over, he left everything to her, including taking care of Sarah and the house chores, and he himself was sound asleep in bed. Well, it seems his mother must have thought, why do I have to do the wife's work? She didn't do any housework and completely neglected Sarah's care. I rushed to Sarah and made dinner for her. While Jack was still asleep, I called my father-in-law. Unlike my mother-in-law, who valued only her son and didn't listen to anyone else's opinions, my father-in-law was a reasonable person. When I told him everything about how my mother-in-law had barged into our house, lectured me absurdly, and even said to put Sarah up for adoption, he was as angry as I was and came to pick her up right away. "You don't have to deal with the relatives much anymore. I'll make sure my wife stays away from this house too," said my father-in-law, grabbing his wife by the scruff of her neck, who was screaming, "Why do I have to be yelled at? This woman married Jack, didn't she? Then she should serve Jack and listen to what I say too, and put her in the car. Enough already. Do you want to make your own son good for nothing? Our grandchild was just born, and now everything is ruined because of you." My father-in-law was angry. Of course, my father-in-law wants to love his grandchild. Nevertheless, my father-in-law saying minimal interaction with relatives is fine was probably to protect me and Sarah. I can only thank my father-in-law. Then, we stopped seeing my in-laws so often, no big incidents happened, and when Sarah was in 8th grade, something happened. Shockingly, my father-in-law had passed away. He had been complaining about feeling unwell for several days, so he was on his way to the hospital when he lost consciousness. He was rushed to the hospital, but it seems luck was not on his side. Suddenly, my father-in-law's death saddened me. Of course, Jack, who lost his real father, was also sad. And even though she hadn't been interacting with the relatives, Sarah, who had continued to correspond with her grandfather in 8th grade, was very upset. Since they were pen pals, Sarah might have been sadder than me. After all, I couldn't help but think, who's going to stop my mother-in-law now? While it's sad that my father-in-law passed away, the fact that there is now no one to stop that reckless and hateful mother-in-law who dislikes both me and Sarah is very frightening. In the future, my mother-in-law might storm into our house. After all, until now, even if she tried to come to our house, my father-in-law had been strictly managing the money so she wouldn't have the travel expenses, and had even made her give up her driver's license. But now, my father-in-law's inheritance is hers, and no one around to tell her how to use that inheritance. It seemed as though my fears had come true when my mother-in-law approached us as the funeral ended and relatives gathered, declaring, "I'm going to move into your house soon." Certainly, since my father-in-law has passed away, my mother-in-law will be living alone in her house. However, even so, I absolutely cannot agree to live with my mother-in-law, who sees me and Sarah as nuisances. Especially considering that Sarah is in a sensitive period of adolescence, being in 8th grade. "I'm sorry, but living together is impossible," I firmly refused, and my mother-in-law glared at me as if she were going to spit at me. Then, she put her hand on Jack's arm and said in a frail, elderly voice, "Jack, you really married a cold-hearted wife, didn't you? I want to talk to you alone." She then separated Jack from us. Next to me, Sarah let out a big sigh and said, "Grandma is really a troublesome person. Grandpa used to say that in his letters. If it's good for her, she doesn't care about those around her. That's why there's been trouble for a long time." Saying that, Sarah just shrugged her shoulders. In the past, Sarah used to be attached to Jack, who took care of her, but recently she seems to have realized that it's me who is earning money and supporting the household. She has come to favor me over her father. Well, Jack still sees Sarah as a little girl, so I guess it makes sense that they don't see eye to eye, since Sarah wants to grow up quickly. "Hey, Sarah. Mom really thinks it's impossible to live with your grandma. But what if Dad and Grandma ignore what I say and try to live together in the house?" I said, hesitating to tell her the whole story. Because what I'm about to say is a heavy topic for a middle schooler like Sarah. Considering Sarah's feelings, I also felt that making such a decision might be wrong. However, Sarah seemed more mature than I thought, and she said, "If you're going to divorce Dad, I'm definitely going with you, Mom." It seems that Sarah immediately caught on to what I was trying to say about possibly divorcing her father. Moreover, I was truly happy that Sarah said she would side with me. But having a daughter in middle school, I thought it might be better to keep the family together until Sarah graduates from college. But it seemed that Sarah had also noticed my hesitation. You know, Mom, I think it's okay for you to leave if you can't bear it. And I can't stand Grandma either, so if staying with Dad means having Grandma around, I think divorce is the only option, Sarah said firmly, indicating her willingness to leave her father. I think the last time Sarah and my mother-in-law met was when Sarah was very small, so maybe she remembers the unpleasant attitude my mother-in-law showed her at that time? I found out for the first time that Sarah disliked my mother-in-law so much. While surprised, I thought to myself, that's right. Living with such a person would be worse for Sarah than divorcing. But Jack, who had been talking to my mother-in-law alone, seemed to have a completely different idea, and as soon as we got home from the funeral, Jack said to me, I'm going to live with Mom. But my opinion hasn't changed since the old days. I absolutely refuse. Living with your mother, even if the world turns upside down, is unthinkable. Even though I firmly refused to live with my mother-in-law, Jack glared at me, saying that he couldn't back down because she's his mother. This is my house. Obey me. No matter what you say, I'm going to have Mom live in this house. It felt more like a command to me, his wife, rather than a request to live with his mother. Maybe when he was talking to his mother alone, she told him something like make your wife obey? That would be just like her. I frowned upon hearing that and said, this is the house I inherited from my parents. Why is my husband acting like it's his house when it's mine? But, while I was trying to have a proper conversation, my husband was taking an aggressive attitude as if he could control me by doing so, raising his voice, I'm the one paying the rent. Then this house is mine. Not yours. I was speechless. Though he's not the one paying for it. While I was unable to say anything, my husband, perhaps thinking he had one, snorted and heavily sat down on the living room couch. I let out a big sigh. Why is Jack under the impression that he's the one paying the rent for this house? I thought for a bit. I'm the one paying the rent for this house. Moreover, this house is something I'm renting from my parents, and I'm the one that made the contract. In this agreement, Jack is considered an outsider. And Jack's only financial contribution every month is the savings for Sarah. As you know, Jack is a freelance photographer and doesn't have a stable income. So, I thought it would be risky to leave him in charge of things that must absolutely be paid every month, such as groceries and electric bills, and instead had told him to put money into savings for Sarah, which didn't have to be paid every month but would be better if saved. I think Jack had been putting in $300 to $500 every month into that account. Perhaps he's thinking that's the rent? Thinking this, I shook my head and said, no. There's no way he could make such a misunderstanding, I thought, but no matter how much I thought about it, the only money Jack has been paying, aside from Sarah's birthday presents and other unexpected expenses, is about that. Rent is something that has to be paid every month, so there's no way he's confusing that with the rent. What on earth is this man misunderstanding? I thought, and immediately talked to Sarah. Sarah, who had apparently been listening to Jack and me in the hallway outside the living room, shrugged her shoulders and said, it's hopeless now. I heard from Grandpa, but Dad's been spoiled rotten by Grandma, thinking everyone around him will do as he says. My father-in-law used to say something to the effect of, do you intend to make my son a good-for-nothing, when he came to our house to pick up my mother-in-law, and I finally understood what he meant. The more my mother-in-law spoiled Jack, the more Jack would become a good-for-nothing. And, as a result, this had affected us in the worst way. Divorce has been decided between Sarah and me, but that aside, my mother-in-law is going to barge into our house. In that case, other measures will be necessary. I found out the day my mother-in-law was coming from Jack and told my parents. It's only natural. The owners of this house are my parents, and currently, they are renting it out to our family, so if my mother-in-law arbitrarily says, I'm going to live here, we'll have to call the owners of the house. An hour before my mother-in-law was due to arrive, my parents arrived at the house, and Jack was in a panic, saying, "WHY are Amy's parents coming to the house?" Even though he's under the mistaken impression that he's paying the rent, he must understand that this house belongs to my parents and that I'm just borrowing it now, so that's probably why he's panicking. I've properly told my parents about what's happened, so my parents have been giving Jack stern looks from the beginning, saying, "Jack, you are Amy's husband and Sarah's father. Yet, even though they both are strongly against it, you seem to be forcibly trying to have your mother live with you. And that mother is coming here today, my father said to a trembling Jack, who answered, but, Dad passed away. My father continued, so what? Just because she's alone? There are other ways if she's lonely, but you are neglecting the family you should protect and calling your mother to this house. Then we have no choice but to evict you from this house. What? Why? This house was handed over to my daughter, not you. My daughter seems to be going to divorce you, and we won't let you and your mother live here. Jack looked at me in surprise, but quickly snorted. I'm the one paying the rent, how can you allow this? But reality was different. My father sighed and said, I have been receiving the rent from my daughter every month. I've never received it from you, and Jack's eyes widened. When I said to Jack, could it be that you thought you were transferring money to my dad's account, when you were actually putting it into the account for Sarah? Jack began to hold his head on the spot, recalling his actions at the time of the transfer. It finally dawned on him that the account he'd been putting money into was not his father-in-law's, but the one he'd made for his daughter. Both my parents and I were dumbfounded by his series of actions. After a while, his mother-in-law came to our house. She arrived in high spirits, but upon seeing my parents standing like sentinels at the front door, waiting for her, she suddenly became nervous. When my parents spoke about Jack's and my divorce, the mother-in-law joyfully said, finally, Jack's free from that horrible wife, but when they explained that Jack would be kicked out right away because the house was not his, she turned pale and exclaimed, what? I sold my house. I thought we could live here. Though she said this, my father and mother adamantly refused to let her in, and eventually, she broke down crying and ran away somewhere. Jack also ran after his mother like that. While they were gone, we called a locksmith to change the locks. Now neither Jack's mother nor Jack will be able to enter the house without our knowledge. I immediately had a lawyer proceed with the divorce, and I became a single mother. Sarah also said about our divorce, it was a bold decision, but I think it was good. Dad hasn't been taking photos at all lately, and he was becoming a bum. Plus, if Grandma was added, I think my college fund would have been used. After the divorce, it seems Jack and his mother-in-law have started living in a cheap, run-down apartment. The mother-in-law, realizing that they can't live on Jack's earnings, is now working diligently at a part-time job, but someday, that life will probably collapse. Well, it's none of our business. Right now, my daughter and I are living happily together.